It was the fastest plane of World War II. It moved so fast that American gunners couldn't even track it. But the pilots inside weren't afraid of the enemy. They were afraid of their own fuel. Because if that fuel touched you, you didn't just burn, you dissolved. The date is August 16, 1944. The location is Brandis Airfield near Leipzig, Germany. The sky is a flat, oppressive gray, heavy with the soot of burning oil refineries in the distance. On the runway, a strange object is approaching. It has no tail. It has no propeller. It moves in absolute silence, gliding over the grass like a predatory bird that has exhausted its energy. It is the Messerschmitt Me 163, Komet. To the desperate high command of the Third Reich, it is a miracle weapon. To the young men strapped inside its cramped cockpit, it is a flying coffin. The aircraft skids to a halt on a retractable metal runner, digging a furrow into the earth. Immediately, a ground crew rushes toward it, but they are not wearing the standard grease-stained overalls of the Luftwaffe mechanics. They are dressed in thick, rubberized asbestos suits that cover them from head to toe. They wear heavy respirators that make them look like deep-sea divers or creatures from another world. They do not approach with the casual speed of a pit crew. They approach with terror, wielding high-pressure water hoses like weapons. They are not there to service the plane. They are there to neutralize it. The crew leader climbs on to the swept-back wing and unlatches the canopy. He expects to see a pilot exhausted from the G-forces of combat, or perhaps wounded by a stray bullet from an American Mustang. But when the glass canopy swings open, a cloud of acrid chemical steam billows out, stinging his eyes even through the mask. The sight inside is something that defies human biology. The pilot is dead, but he has not been shot. He has not been burned by fire. During the violent landing, a fuel line behind the seat had ruptured. A clear, highly volatile liquid had sprayed onto the pilot's flight suit. There was no explosion. Instead, there was a violent, bubbling chemical reaction. The liquid, a substance known as T-Stoff, had eaten through the thick leather of the flight suit in seconds. It had eaten through the skin, the muscle, and the organs. The pilot had not died from impact. He had been dissolved. He had been reduced to a gelatinous, organic sludge while still strapped into his harness. Only his metal belt buckle and his glass flight goggles remain intact in the mess. This horrific scene was not an anomaly. It was a recurring nightmare in the development of the world's first rocket-powered fighter. The Me 163 Komet was a marvel of engineering, capable of speeds that shattered the records of the 1940s. It could climb vertically into the stratosphere in 3 minutes. It was untouchable. But it came with a devil's bargain. It was powered by a fuel so unstable, so corrosive, and so hostile to organic matter that the plane killed more of its own pilots in training accidents than it ever killed Allied bombers in combat. To understand why anyone would volunteer to sit on top of a tank of boiling acid, we must look at the state of Germany in 1944. The 1,000-year Reich was crumbling into ash. The Luftwaffe, once the ruler of the skies, had been obliterated. Every day, thousands of American B-17 flying fortresses blackened the sun, raining destruction on German cities with impunity. The conventional German fighters were too slow, too few, and out of gas. Hermann Goering and the Nazi leadership were desperate. They didn't need a plane that was safe. They didn't need a plane that could land. They needed a monster that could scream into the sky, tear apart the bombers, and vanish. They needed a miracle. And desperation is the mother of madness. The answer to Germany's desperate need for a miracle weapon did not come from the established giants of aviation like Willy Messerschmitt or Kurt Tank. It came from an outsider, a man who had spent his life obsessed with aerodynamic purity, Alexander Lippisch. Lippisch was a visionary, but he was not originally a designer of warplanes. He was a glider enthusiast. For decades, he had been chasing a singular, radical dream, the Nurflügel, or all-wing aircraft. He believed that the tail of a traditional plane was nothing but a parasite, a structural burden that created drag and killed speed. If he could eliminate the tail, he believed he could create the ultimate flying machine. In the secretive hangars of the DFS, German Research Institute for Sailplane Flight, Lippisch had been experimenting with strange, tailless gliders long before the war turned against Germany. His designs were elegant, futuristic, and completely alien to the angular, propeller-driven fighters of the era. They looked like bats or eggs with stubby, swept-back wings. When the Reich Aviation Ministry demanded a high-speed interceptor to stop the American bombers, Lippisch didn't design a weapon from scratch. He simply took his most advanced glider airframe, the DFS-194, and modified it to accept a heart of fire. He proposed strapping a volatile rocket engine to a delicate wooden glider. The result was Project X, later designated the Me-163. It was a Frankenstein's monster of aviation. It combined the delicate, lightweight airframe of a glider, constructed mostly of plywood and glued fabric, with the brutal, brute force power of a liquid-fueled rocket engine designed by Helmuth Walter. The physics were terrifyingly simple. The rocket would provide a tremendous, violent burst of thrust to shoot the aircraft vertically into the thin air of the stratosphere. Once the fuel was exhausted, the rocket would die, and the aircraft would become a glider again, silently swooping down to attack the bombers before drifting back to Earth. But this design philosophy created immediate, lethal compromises. To achieve the necessary speed and climb rate to intercept high-altitude bombers, the plane had to be small and incredibly light. Every ounce of weight was an enemy. There was no room for heavy armor plate to protect the pilot. There was no room for redundant safety systems. And perhaps most fatally, there was no room for landing gear. Lippisch and his team made a decision based on cold mathematics that would doom dozens of future pilots. They calculated that retractable landing gear was too heavy and took up valuable internal volume needed for the massive fuel tanks, so they simply removed it. Instead of wheels, the Me-163 sat on a temporary two-wheeled axle called a dolly. The pilot would take off using these wheels, and once airborne, he would pull a cable to jettison the dolly, dropping it onto the runway. For landing, the plane had only a crude, retractable metal skid underneath the belly, essentially a single ski. This meant the Komet would have to skid to a halt on the grass like a sled. It was a primitive solution for a futuristic machine, introducing a critical point of failure at the two most dangerous moments of flight, takeoff and landing. The pilot was now trapped in a delicate wooden egg, sitting on a bomb, with no reliable way to return to the Earth. The heart of the Me-163 was the Walter HWK-109509 rocket motor. But the blood that ran through its veins was a substance so volatile it seemed summoned from a chemist's nightmare. Unlike a conventional engine, which requires a spark plug to ignite gasoline mixed with air, The Komet's engine used a hypergolic propellant system. This meant the fuel did not need a spark. It did not need oxygen from the atmosphere. It simply needed to touch. The system relied on two distinct liquids stored in separate tanks flanking the pilot. On one side was C-Stoff, a mixture of methanol and hydrazine hydrate. On the other was T-Stoff, a highly concentrated solution of hydrogen peroxide. Separately, they were unstable and toxic, but when they were injected together into the combustion chamber, the reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. They expanded at supersonic speeds, generating 3,800 pounds of thrust in a fraction of a second. It was essentially a controlled explosion, occurring just inches behind the pilot's spine. The pilot wasn't flying a plane. He was riding a bomb that was exploding continuously.
Of the two fluids, T-Stoff was the true monster. It was an oxidizer of terrifying potency. In its concentrated form, it despised organic matter. If T-Stoff dripped onto a piece of cloth, the cloth would spontaneously burst into flames. If it touched leather, it would liquefy it. If it splashed onto metal that hadn't been specially treated, it would begin to eat through the structure of the aircraft itself. Refueling the Komet became a ritual of extreme terror for the ground crews. They had to wear heavy rubber and asbestos suits, not for protection against fire, but against corrosion. The fueling hoses were notoriously leaky. A single drop of T-Stoff falling onto the runway would hiss and burn a hole in the concrete. The crews had to keep thousands of gallons of water on standby to instantly dilute any spills. They worked in a cloud of acrid steam, moving with slow, deliberate caution, knowing that a slipped hose or a cracked valve could result in a gruesome death before the plane even left the ground.
For the pilot, the danger was intimate. Because the plane had no tail and no fuselage space, the fuel tanks were wrapped around the cockpit. The pilot sat with a tank of C-Stoff behind him and tanks of T-Stoff literally resting on his knees and shoulders. He was engulfed by the chemicals. Pilots reported a distinctive, sour smell inside the cockpit, the scent of ozone and leaking oxidizer. It was the smell of a dentist's office mixed with burning electrical wire. This configuration meant that in the event of a crash or a hard landing, the tanks would almost certainly rupture. And because the pilot was sandwiched between them, he would be the first point of contact for the mixing fluids. There were no ejection seats. There were no fire suppression systems that could stop a hypergolic reaction. If the tanks cracked, the pilot became the catalyst. The T-Stoff would strip the flesh from his bones before he even had time to unbuckle his harness. This was the witch's brew that powered the hope of the Third Reich. The takeoff procedure for the Me-163 was not a flight maneuver. It was a ballistic event. The pilot sat on the runway, strapped tightly into the cockpit, waiting for the signal flare. Unlike a propeller-driven Messerschmitt Bf-109, which roared and vibrated with the rhythm of pistons, the Komet sat in eerie silence until the moment of ignition. When the pilot engaged the Walter motor, there was no slow buildup of power. The reaction was binary. 3,000 pounds of thrust slammed the aircraft forward instantly. The pilot was crushed back into his seat with spine-compressing force, his vision blurring as the G-forces spiked. Within seconds, the aircraft was screaming down the grass strip at 180 miles per hour. The sensation was described by survivors not as flying, but as being fired from a cannon. The vibration was so intense that the instrument panel became unreadable. The pilot was merely a passenger on a runaway rocket, gripping the stick with white knuckles, waiting for the precise second to leave the Earth. But leaving the ground was only the first hurdle.
The second hurdle was the one that killed the most men.
As the Komet lifted its nose, the pilot had to pull a mechanical release lever to jettison the dolly, the heavy set of wheels that allowed the glider to roll. This was the most critical moment of the launch. If the pilot dropped the dolly too late, the extra weight and drag would prevent him from climbing, causing the plane to stall and crash into the trees at the end of the runway. If he dropped it too early, the wheels would fall, hit the concrete runway, and bounce back up. The dolly weighed hundreds of pounds. If it rebounded and struck the underside of the delicate wooden fuselage, it would rupture the fuel tanks sitting just inches above the skin. Ground crews watched in helpless terror as comets lifted off, dropped their wheels, and then instantly vanished in a blinding sphere of white fire. The mixing T-Stoff and C-Stoff didn't just explode, they detonated with such ferocity that there was often no wreckage left to salvage, only a scorched crater in the grass. The pilot was erased from existence before he had reached an altitude of 50 feet.
If the wheels fell away cleanly, the Komet was free. Freed from the drag of the Earth, the rocket motor pushed the aircraft to speeds that were previously the realm of science fiction. The pilot pulled the stick back, and the nose pointed almost straight up. The Me-163 climbed at a staggering 70-degree angle. It ascended at a rate of 12,000 feet per minute. To put that in perspective, the American P-51 Mustang climbed at less than 3,000 feet per minute. The Komet tore through the cloud layers like a needle. To the Allied bomber crews watching from miles away, it was a terrifying sight. One moment, the sky below was empty. The next, a thick pillar of white smoke appeared, growing vertically with impossible speed. It looked less like an airplane and more like an anti-aircraft missile. In 3 minutes, the pilot was at 30,000 feet. He was above the bombers. He was the king of the sky. But his reign would be short. The fuel gauge was already dropping to zero. The rocket was sputtering out. The noise was about to stop, and the deadliest part of the mission, the silent attack, was about to begin. At 30,000 feet, the Komet pilot leveled off. The rocket motor, consuming fuel at a rate of 10 pounds per second, had only moments of life left. The pilot scanned the horizon and spotted the Wehrmachts, the 4-engined American bombers. He pushed the stick forward, diving toward them like a hawk striking a flock of pigeons. But this hawk was moving too fast for its own good. The closing speed between a diving Me-163 and an oncoming B-17 Flying Fortress was over 500 miles per hour. This speed was unheard of in 1944. It created a tactical nightmare that the German engineers had not fully anticipated. From the moment the pilot identified his specific target to the moment he would collide with it, he had roughly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he had to calculate the lead angle, arm his weapons, fire, and pull up violently to avoid smashing into the massive bomber. It was a mathematical impossibility. The human brain simply could not process the geometry of the attack fast enough. American gunners later reported seeing comets streak right through their formations without firing a single shot. The German pilots, frozen, merely holding on for dear life as the shapes of the bombers blurred past them. To make the situation even more desperate, the Me-163 was armed with the wrong weapons for high-speed warfare. It carried two 30mm Mk-108 cannons. These were devastating weapons. A single hit could blow the wing off a B-17. But they were low-velocity guns, nicknamed pneumatic hammers for their slow rate of fire and heavy recoil. The shells didn't fly straight. They lobbed through the air like thrown rocks. The pilot was flying the fastest machine on Earth, trying to hit a moving target with a slow-moving projectile. To score a hit, he had to get dangerously close, within 200 yards. But at 600 miles per hour, 200 yards vanishes in the blink of an eye. Most pilots found themselves overshooting, firing wildly into empty space, or pulling away too early. The Komet was a technological masterpiece, armed with a Stone Age club. It was a weapon system that was out of sync with itself.
And then the timer ran out. The Me-163 carried only enough fuel for about 7 minutes of powered flight. 3 minutes to climb, 3 minutes to attack, and perhaps 1 minute of reserve. Suddenly, the deafening roar of the Walter rocket engine cut out. The violent vibration that rattled the pilot's teeth ceased instantly. The pilot was thrown forward against his harness as the thrust evaporated. The fastest machine on Earth was now just a heavy, silent glider. The Komet had burned out. The pilot was now 30,000 feet in the air, deep inside enemy territory, with no engine and no way to restart it. He was no longer the hunter. He was falling leaf. As he began his long, silent glide back to Earth, the American fighter escorts, the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, looked up. They saw the smoke trail end. They knew the German was helpless, and they began to dive. The rat-catching was about to begin. The moment the rocket engine died, the Me-163 underwent a radical transformation. It ceased to be a weapon of war and became a heavy, unpowered glider made of plywood and steel. The pilot was now falling toward the Earth, trading his altitude for speed, but he had lost his ability to fight. He could not climb, he could not accelerate, he could only descend. The Allied fighter pilots, flying P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, quickly adapted to the Komet. They realized it was futile to chase the machine while it was under power. It was simply too fast. So they developed a cruel and effective tactic known as rat-catching. They stopped chasing the Komet going up. Instead, they circled the German airfields like sharks, waiting for the fuel-starved gliders to drift home. As the German pilot lined up for his final approach, concentrating on his airspeed and glide path, he was a sitting duck. He would see tracers flashing past his canopy, chipping away at his wooden wings. He was defenseless, forced to endure the strafing runs while praying he reached the flak protection of his own airfield before his luck ran out. But even if the pilot evaded the American hunters, he still had to survive the ground. Landing the Me-163 was a procedure that required surgical precision in a machine built with a sledgehammer. Because the plane had dropped its wheels at takeoff, it had to land on a retractable steel skid, essentially a metal ski extending from the belly. A normal glider lands at a gentle pace. The Komet came in hot, hitting the grass at over 130 miles per hour. The pilot had one chance. Since he had no engine, there was no go-around. If he overshot the runway, he crashed. If he undershot, he crashed. The physical toll of this landing method was brutal. The Komet had no shock absorbers. When the steel skid slammed into the uneven turf of the airfield, the impact force was transmitted directly upward into the pilot's spine. Spinal compression fractures were so common among Komet pilots that the Luftwaffe doctors eventually had to design a special spring-loaded seat cushion to absorb the blow.
These men were literally breaking their backs just trying to bring the plane home. But the skid had a fatal design flaw. It was narrow. If the plane hit a rut in the grass, or if a crosswind caught one of the wings, the aircraft would wobble. If a wingtip dug into the dirt at 100 miles per hour, the plane would cartwheel. This was the moment of maximum danger. Even though the fuel tanks were theoretically empty, the plumbing of the rocket engine always retained a few liters of the hypergolic sludge, residual T-Stoff and C-Stoff sloshing in the bottom of the tanks. If the plane flipped, those residual fluids would leak and mix. Ground crews watched in horror as gliding comets touched down safely, skidded for 100 yards, hit a bump, and then instantly vanished in a blinding white fireball. There was no wreckage to salvage. The explosion was so hot it melted the aluminum airframe into puddles. The pilot was not killed, he was vaporized. The landing was often the deadliest part of the entire mission.
The statistics of the Komet program were grim, but numbers are abstract. The horror of the Me-163 is best understood through the fate of Oberlieutenant Yoshi Puss. Puss was not a novice. He was a decorated ace, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and one of the most skilled test pilots in the Luftwaffe. He was one of the few men who had mastered the erratic handling of the rocket plane. In late 1943, Puss took off for a routine test flight from Bad Zwischenahn. Shortly after launch, the release mechanism for the takeoff dolly failed. The heavy wheels refused to drop. Knowing he couldn't land with the dolly attached, it would cause the plane to somersault, Puss decided to wait until his fuel was exhausted and attempt a belly landing in the grass, hoping the dolly would shear off on impact. It was a calculated risk, the kind a brave pilot makes. He brought the plane down, the skid hit the earth, the plane bounced, twisted, and flipped over. The crash itself was not violent enough to kill him. The aircraft did not explode. To the ground crews rushing toward the site, it looked like a survivable accident. They expected to pull posts from the wreckage, perhaps with a few broken bones, but as they approached, they saw the T-Stoff leaking. The corrosive oxidizer was dripping from the inverted tanks directly into the cockpit. Posts had been soaked in the chemical. T-Stoff does not just burn, it dissolves. It reacts with the water in human tissue to create extreme heat and rapid decomposition. By the time the rescue team pried the canopy open, Oberleutnant Puss was gone. He hadn't been crushed, he had been liquefied. The chemical had eaten through his flight suit and dissolved his entire body into a gelatinous sludge. The only things that remained intact inside the cockpit were his ceramic glass flight goggles and the stainless steel buckles of his parachute harness. The man himself had been erased by his own machine. News of Puss's death spread through the squadron like a contagion. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 400, the unit dedicated to flying the Komet, realized they were members of a suicide club. They weren't afraid of the American Mustangs. They weren't afraid of the B-17 gunners. They were afraid of the devil's brew sloshing behind their seats. They began to exhibit signs of extreme psychological stress. They developed dark humor, joking about being pre-cremated. They drank heavily. Every time they climbed into the cockpit, they could smell the sour, metallic odor of the T-Stoff residue. It was the scent of the Reaper. Yet, incredibly, they kept flying. Driven by a mix of fatalism, patriotism, and the sheer addiction to the speed the rocket offered, they strapped themselves back into the acid tanks day after day, waiting for their turn to dissolve. In the cold light of historical analysis, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet stands as one of the most inefficient weapons ever devised. The Nazi propaganda machine hailed it as the savior of the Reich, promising that swarms of rocket fighters would sweep the American bombers from the sky. But the reality was a mathematical disaster. The operational records of Jagdgeschwader 400 tell a damning story. Over the course of its entire service life, from 1944 to the end of the war, the Komet fleet is credited with destroying somewhere between 9 and 16 Allied aircraft. To achieve this negligible score, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 100 Messerschmitt Me 163s. The exchange ratio was catastrophic. For every American bomber destroyed, the Germans lost roughly 6 to 10 of their own advanced fighters. But the statistics hide a darker truth. The vast majority of these German losses were not due to enemy fire. They were own goals. They were takeoff explosions, landing accidents, and mid-air disintegrations caused by fuel leaks. The Messerschmitt Me 163 was a weapon that spent more time killing its own defenders than it did attacking the. The failure wasn't just in the kill count, it was in the concept itself. The Komet was a point defense interceptor with a fatal flaw: range. Because the rocket engine consumed fuel so voraciously, the aircraft had an endurance of only 7 minutes. This meant it could only protect a tiny circle of airspace, perhaps 20 miles wide, directly above its own airfield. The American bomber commanders quickly realized this. They simply routed their flight paths around the known Komet bases. The German pilots would sit in their cockpits, fueled and ready to explode, watching helplessly as the bomber streams flew just out of reach, devastating German cities while the miracle weapon remained grounded by the laws of physics. Furthermore, the logistical footprint was enormous. To keep a single Komet flying required a specialized fleet of acid-resistant tanker trucks, thousands of tons of distilled water for safety washdowns, and rare chemical components that a starving Germany could barely produce. The program sucked resources away from the production of conventional fighters that might have actually made a difference. But the most unforgivable resource the Komet wasted was not fuel or metal. It was men. The pilots recruited for the Me 163 program were not raw conscripts. They were the elite. They were veterans with hundreds of combat hours, men who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. They were the backbone of the Luftwaffe. To take these highly skilled aviators and strap them into a machine with a 50% accident rate was strategic suicide. Every time a veteran ace like Yoshi Post was dissolved in a landing accident, the Luftwaffe lost years of irreplaceable experience. The Komet did not save the Reich, it bled it dry. It was a vampire, feeding on the very nation it was built to protect, offering nothing in return but smoke and empty promises. By May 1945, the guns fell silent. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. Allied troops swept across Germany, not just as conquerors, but as scavengers. Intelligence officers from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were engaged in a frantic race against time and each other. Their mission was not to capture territory, but to harvest the scientific organs of the dead Nazi regime. They were looking for the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons. When American units secured the airfields at Brandis and Husum, they found the surviving Me 163s sitting in silence, hidden under camouflage netting or abandoned in hangars. To the average infantryman, they looked like broken toys, but to the technical intelligence officers of the Army Air Forces, they were a revelation. They walked around the swept-back wings. They peered into the rocket nozzles. They realized that despite the Comet's operational failure, the aerodynamics were a decade ahead of anything the Allies possessed. While the Americans and British were still refining propeller-driven aircraft and experimenting with straight-wing jets, the Germans had already solved the equations of high-speed flight. The Comet was a death trap, yes, but it was a death trap that whispered the secrets of the future. The order came down immediately. Pack them up. The surviving Comets were disassembled. The wings were detached from the fuselages. They were crated and shipped across the Atlantic to Wright Field in Ohio and to research centers in Britain. But the Allies were smart enough to leave the fuel behind. They understood that the Walter rocket motor was a dead end, too dangerous and too volatile for practical use. They didn't want the heart of the beast, they wanted its skin. They wanted to understand the shape. The British test pilot Eric Winkle Brown, a man of supreme courage, actually flew a captured Me-163 under power, but only after the British ground crews terrified themselves trying to fuel it. Brown survived the flight, noting the incredible speed, but described the aircraft as a wild beast that wanted to kill him. After a few test flights, the Allies concluded that the rocket interceptor concept was flawed. The machines were grounded forever, destined for museums. But the mind that created them was far too valuable to be discarded. Alexander Lippisch, the father of the Komet, was detained by the United States. Under the secretive Operation Paperclip, he, along with Werner von Braun and hundreds of other German scientists, was extracted from the ruins of Europe. He was not put on trial for the deaths of the pilots his machine had dissolved. He was given a contract. Lippisch was brought to America, where his knowledge was scrubbed of its Nazi origins and transplanted into the U.S. military-industrial complex. The data harvested from the suicidal flights of the Me-163 became the DNA for the next generation of American air power. The swept-wing data influenced the F-86 Sabre. Lippisch's obsession with the tailless Delta wing eventually evolved into the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger and the F-106 Delta Dart, nuclear-armed interceptors that defended America during the Cold War. The ghost of the Komet did not die in 1945, it simply changed its uniform. The weapon that had been built to destroy American bombers became the blueprint for the planes that would protect American cities.